Hi again. We're going to go through now Wednesday's lesson. And Wednesday's lesson was a discussion on question number 3. And I asked the students what you all thought of these 3 characters. So again, question number 3 is asking us to look in the story and find evidence supporting what type of character your choice of character is. So we started with the grandfather and then went to the boy and then started talking about Masood. So again, what we want to find information from different parts of the story about these characters. And in some cases, we want to find information from different perspectives about these characters. And so we'll start with the grandfather here. So the fundamental question that this is really asking you is to describe what type of character the grandfather is, or the boy, or Masood. So we're asking ourselves, what is this grandfather like? So if you are just starting out with this question, it might be helpful to write down a list of adjectives that you would associate with the grandfather. So, in other words, based on your reading of the story, how would you describe him? He's a blank type of person. Okay. And then after you have that list of adjectives, maybe go through the story and look and see what evidence supports your point of view. So let's just take a look at a couple different parts of the story here. So, remember, we're looking for physical descriptions, we're looking for dialogue, so in other words, things that the grandfather says, we're looking for things that other people say about the grandfather, we're looking for actions. All of these things can tell us what type of a person the grandfather is. So in these first 2 paragraphs, if you read these first 2 paragraphs closely, you'll see that there's a lot about the grandfather in here. There are physical descriptions of the grandfather, of his height, so he's a tall man, of his sharp nose and his beard. And it goes on and on about this beard of the grandfather that is pure white, and it's the most beautiful thing the boy has ever seen. And at the end of this paragraph, the second big paragraph here, the boy basically tells us exactly how he feels about the grandfather. And so this first page is a good place to start. Just kind of going in order here. In terms of dialogue, the second page also tells us a lot about the grandfather. And on this second page here, we actually get a statement from him, basically telling us his life's goal. And if you read this, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's in regards to Masood and Masood's land. So a lot of people have taken this piece of information and come up with at least one adjective to describe the grandfather, just based on this section. So we can look at what the grandfather says, the grandfather's descriptions of Masood, and then we can also look at how the grandfather behaves during the date harvest. And we can see that, in the first part, I mentioned that the narrator describes the grandfather as being tall, very tall. So when you think about that's mentioned again and again and again, you have to think that it might have some deeper meaning other than just the fact that he's tall. When you think of a tall character in a movie or a book or a story, usually the person is either commanding a good amount of respect, or he has power, or he has influence. So the height is a quick sort of subconscious symbol to alert us that the grandfather in this story is a person of influence. And one crucial thing about the grandfather is that he owns a lot of land. And so we know that he is living in a village. And so if it's not a huge city, it's a village, so people know him. And so look at during the date harvest, watch how other people look to the grandfather, and watch how the grandfather's influence is felt here. And so you should have a good deal of information to be able to come to any conclusions of how the grandfather is or how the grandfather behaves. Next, we talked about the boy. So the narrator of the story, obviously, so there's a lot we can say about him. There are only a couple places where the boy is describing himself. And so obviously you can't just rely on those places where the boy is describing himself. We want, as I said, we want to get a diversity of information here. So one thing you don't have with the boy is you don't have other people talking about the boy. So we don't have that where we have with the grandfather, the boy's talking a lot about the grandfather, or Masood. Both the boy and the grandfather talk about Masood. So with the boy, you have to come to conclusions based on what you see, based on what the boy's thoughts are, because he's the narrator, so we get access to his thoughts and how he's reacting to things and how he's processing things. What he says, how he reacts. So let's take a look in the text. We'll start at the beginning again. And this first page and then the first paragraph on page 2 do give us a decent amount of information on the boy, what the boy likes to do, what his hobbies are, how he sees the grandfather, how he sees himself. And on the second page here, the first paragraph of the second page is one of the places where the boy he declares something about himself. So you want to read that paragraph. One question I think it's an interesting question when you're thinking about the boy is the boy naive or is the boy mature? Or is he somewhere in between those two? Because there are parts in this story where the boy is describing himself, he's describing his imagination and how he likes to play. And on the top right of the second page, he's talking about how I don't really care who owns the dates or the trees or the land. All I know is basically that I like to play in this land. But we see him moving back and forth between these sort of childlike observations and then very sort of adult observations about, just realizing the nature of the relationship between the grandfather and Masood and the nature of the reality around him. So, do you think the boy is aloof, meaning he's disconnected? Do you think he's perceptive? Do you think he's intelligent? Do you think he's sensitive, or do you think he's callous? And so we also want to look at and remember that the observations in the story come from the boy. So the description of the date harvest is from the boy's perspective. So we can also glean some information about the boy from what he's observing and what he's paying attention to. And you can compare how he reacts to how the other kids are reacting in the date harvest. What does the boy notice about what's happening around him? What does he notice about what's happening to Masood in particular? And what does that say about his character? I won't go much further into detail about the boy. Another way to think about this question, if you're going to choose the boy, is to think about how he's transformed throughout the story. So, does he change from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, and how so? Lastly, we talked about Masood. And Masood is a really interesting character. And if you're going to choose Masood, you definitely want to find information from different parts of the story, and I'll show you why. We first get introduced to Masood on page number 2. And the grandfather's perspective is the first perspective we get on this character. And obviously the grandfather has some really strong words about Masood. He clearly believes that Masood is like a ne'er-do-well, basically. He thinks that Masood has just wasted his life. But you don't have to take my word for it. It's here in really plain language. So we start off on page 2 with a perspective of Masood that is really the grandfather's perspective. And so the reason you want to, if you're choosing Masood, you definitely want to look further on in the story, is because to get a full picture of what Masood is like, you have to weigh the grandfather's perspective of Masood with the things the boy observes about Masood. So if you take a look at the end of this second page here, right after this part where the grandfather declares what he wants to do with Masood's land, there's a section where the boy starts to talk about what he remembers about Masood and the things that he has observed. And I think that's a good place to start if you're looking for the boy's perspective. Also, as I said, when a character speaks in a story, they're telling us about who they are and about what they're like. So you want to look through the rest of the story and find pieces of dialogue from Masood that will tell us what he's like. And particularly, I think on this third page, on the second column of the third page, there are 2 lines of dialogue. One that's happening sort of in the moment, in this date harvest, and another that's happening sort of in the boy's memory. And so both of these are really telling about the perspective that Masood has on the world, how he sees things. And if you're going to write about Masood, I think a good comparison is between the grandfather and Masood. And without going into much detail, because I really want this to be your analysis and not mine, I don't think you could find 2 characters with values that are so different from each other. So if you've thought about who the grandfather is and what the grandfather values, thinking about who Masood is and what he values, they're going to be 2 very different things. So that's a good question. If you're choosing Masood, a good question to ask yourself is, what does this person really care about? And you're going to want to take the grandfather's perspective and the boy's perspective and sort of weigh those against each other and think, okay, who has more accurate information about Masood? Is it somewhere in the middle? And that was our discussion about question number 3. Again, you don't have to talk about all of these characters. You just have to choose one. It is useful for you to be able to answer this question about all of these characters. So one good exercise might be to create a list of adjectives for each one of these characters. And then maybe you can choose which one to write a paragraph about. And I'll also encourage you to talk to your classmates over this break. Ask them what they think about these characters.